I want to begin by asking you a question, one I was forced to ask myself about 10 years ago. It's a question that completely reshaped how I understand the world. How do you prepare for something that has never occurred in your own lifetime, yet has happened repeatedly throughout history? For most of my career as a global macro investor, I followed a familiar framework. I studied the last 30, 40, even 50 years of data, and used that to build my mental models. For a long time, that approach worked. But eventually, events started unfolding that my models simply couldn't explain. I watched interest rates fall to zero and then slip into negative territory. I saw central banks create money on a scale with no modern precedent. I witnessed political polarization in the United States reach levels we hadn't seen since the 1930s, with populism surging on both the left and the right. And I observed the rise of a major power, China, challenging the dominant power, the United States, in a way we hadn't experienced since the emergence of Germany or the Soviet Union. At first, when I viewed these developments through the lens of my own lifetime, they looked like anomalies. They felt like black swan events. But when I widened my perspective, when I stepped back and examined the last 500 years, I realized something crucial. These events weren't anomalies at all. They were part of a machine. History is a machine. It's a perpetual motion system driven by logical cause and effect patterns that repeat again and again. I call this process the big cycle. If you want to understand what's happening in the United States today, and if you want to understand the warning signs flashing red, much like they once did in Britain, you need to understand how this cycle works. This cycle typically spans about 250 years, with transition phase lasting roughly 10 to 20 years. It traces the rise and fall of the world's leading empire and its reserve currency. We saw it with the Dutch Empire in the 1600s. We saw it again with the British Empire in the 1800s. And we are witnessing it now with the American Empire. The cycle mirrors a biological lifespan. There is a birth, a period of growth, a peak, and eventually a decline. The rise is a healthy phase. It begins when a country is poor but driven. People are hardworking, debt levels are low, and society is internally cohesive. These nations invest heavily in education, which fuels innovation and technological breakthroughs. The Dutch built ships capable of circling the globe. The British created the steam engine. The Americans developed the internet. These advances make them highly competitive. They produce more than they consume. They become the world's dominant trading power. Over time, that dominance leads the rest of the world to save in their currency. The Dutch guilder, the British pound, and eventually the U.S. dollar all became reserve currencies. This marks the peak. This is where the United States has stood for the past 75 years. But the top is a dangerous place to be. And the reason is human nature. When a nation becomes wealthy and powerful, it often loses the very edge that brought it there. Costs rise. Labor becomes expensive. Competitiveness fades as emerging rivals are willing to work harder for less. Yet the most dangerous change isn't economic. It's psychological. The country shifts from being a nation of producers to one of consumers and financiers. It starts wagering on its own dominance. It borrows to spend more than it earns. It begins to believe prosperity is the natural state rather than the result of discipline and effort. This is a decadence phase. And this is exactly where the British Empire found itself in the early 20th century. The warning I'm sharing today isn't an opinion. It's an observation. The United States is following Britain's trajectory with a correlation that is almost frighteningly precise. We are tracing their path step by step toward a transition for which most of us are entirely unprepared. So let's walk through the story of Britain's decline, because it may very well be a preview of our own future if we fail to change direction. In 1850, Great Britain stood unmatched on the world stage. It produced roughly 20% of global economic output. The British Navy dominated the seas, safeguarding trade across the empire. London was the financial capital of the world. The British pound was as solid as gold, quite literally, since it was backed by gold and held worldwide. But if you examine the data closely, you can see the decay beginning beneath the surface. The first thing an empire loses isn't its military strength or its wealth. It's its competitiveness and its educational edge relative to others. By the late 1800s, Britain's elite had grown complacent. Their children were sent to Eton and Oxford to study Latin, Greek, and the art of being gentlemen, while rising powers like Germany and the United States focus on engineering, chemistry, and physics. In my book Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, I discuss a critical concept called the lag. This idea is essential. There is always a delay between the moment a country loses its real competitive advantage and the moment it loses its prestige, brand power, and reserve currency status. For decades, Britain was losing the economic race, yet it still appeared to be the global superpower. This is the moment of greatest danger, when you feel wealthy, but you are actually becoming poorer. By 1914, the United States had already surpassed Britain economically. We were producing goods more efficiently and at lower cost. Yet Britain continued to act as the world's police force. It stretched itself too thin. And then internal conflict intensified. This is often overlooked, but before World War I, Britain was already fracturing from within. The wealth gap had exploded. The Gilded Age created a powerful class of ultra-wealthy financiers in London, while working families in cities like Manchester and Liverpool struggled just to get by. That imbalance fueled the rise of populism, labor strikes, and deep political division. The internal order, the ability of a nation to cooperate and move forward together, began to fracture. This is exactly what we are witnessing in the United States today. We now face the widest wealth gap since the 1930s. Populist movements are rejecting the establishment, and our political system is increasingly consumed by fighting itself rather than solving national challenges. When an empire is divided internally, it becomes exposed externally. Britain attempted to preserve its global empire, its external order, while its internal cohesion was breaking down and its financial position was weakening. To compensate, it leaned heavily on debt. This is a trap. Britain exploited the so-called exorbitant privilege of the pound, borrowing from British very nations that were rising to challenge. Doesn't move in a straight line. It unfolds slowly, until suddenly it accelerates. The break comes when the debt bill finally arrives. That brings us to mechanics of collapse. How does a superpower actually go broke? I wrote How Countries Go Broke to answer that exact question, because this mechanism is what ultimately ends a big cycle. At its core, it comes down to the difference between hard money and soft money. When a nation is rising, it typically uses hard money, tying its currency to gold or another fixed asset. That connection builds trust. People save in your currency because they believe its value will be preserved. The British pound was once backed by gold. After Bretton Woods in 1944, the U.S. dollar assumed that role. But when a country reaches the top of the cycle, burdened by high debt, costly military commitments, and growing social conflict, the government runs out of room. It faces an intense squeeze. Its obligations, pensions, health care, defense spending, debt, and interest exceed what it can collect in taxes. At that moment, policymakers are left with only two options. And across 500 years of history, they almost always choose the same one. The first option is austerity and default. You cut spending. You tell citizens their pensions will be reduced. You tell bondholders they won't be fully repaid. This leads to a deflationary depression and often sparks revolution. It's politically unbearable. So governments choose the second option. They print money. They abandon hard money, fire up the printing press, and attempt to inflate their way out of debt. Britain did this in 1914 to finance the war, breaking its link to gold. In 1931, during the Great Depression, it devalued the pound against gold. In 1949, it devalued again against the dollar. Then again in 1967. Each time, money printing bought a little more time, but at the cost of eroding the empire's value. Savers were quietly taxed to bail out debtors. The United States now exhibits many of the same late-cycle traits. We call it quantitative easing or debt monetization, but let's be honest about what it is. We are printing money to pay bills we can't afford. At first, it feels good. Asset prices rise. The government sends out checks, but it triggers a run on the bank. The bank, in this case, is the United States. The depositors are foreign central banks, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, who collectively hold trillions in U.S. debt. Right now, we are testing their patience. we are offering them negative real returns. We may pay 4 or 5% interest, but inflation quietly wipes that out. On top of that, we are weaponizing the dollar through sanctions, signaling to the world that if you disagree with us, your assets can be frozen. This is exactly what happened to Britain. Other nations realized holding pounds was risky, so they began selling. When the world stops buying your debt, you're forced to print even more to fill the gap, which accelerates the currency's decline. It becomes a self-reinforcing spiral. This is a financial mechanism that ends an empire's dominance. It's rarely a foreign invasion that finishes a job. It's the loss of reserve currency status. Once that happens, you can no longer consume more than you produce. You revert to being a normal country. Living standards fall, and the empire fades away. So where does that leave us? We are at a point in the cycle where the tectonic plates are shifting. On one side, we have a declining power, the United States, financially overstretched, internally divided, and reliant on money printing. On the other, we have a rising power, China, expanding its military, asserting its influence, and challenging the global system. This brings us to the Thucydides trap. Over the past 500 years, there have been 16 cases where a rising power challenged a dominant one. In 12 of those cases, the outcome was war. Britain faced this dynamic with Germany. It fought 2 world wars, technically winning both, yet losing its empire and financial independence in the process. After World War II, Britain emerged bankrupt, handing control of the global order to the United States. Now, the United States faces China. The struggle is unfolding across every major domain of conflict: trade, technology, capital flows, geopolitics, and potentially the military. But the greatest threat to the United States isn't China. It's us. Britain didn't lose its empire simply because Germany was strong. It lost because it failed to preserve internal unity and financial discipline. If the United States remains locked in internal conflict, if dysfunction prevents us from educating our children, repairing our infrastructure, and balancing our finances, we will fail. A nation at war with itself cannot lead abroad. Still, the big cycle is not destiny. It represents probability, not inevitability. We can change the outcome, but only if we confront reality. We need what I call a beautiful deleveraging, a balanced approach that